Somewhere down below that sheet of white was the rise upon which the building once stood where I was born.
Oh, once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know.
Welcome to Not Forgotten, a weekly podcast sharing the stories of a place known as Utah's Dixie, and brought to you by the Doc Booth Foundation. Through stories as universal as they are personal, this podcast is dedicated to the memory of legendary family physician Dr. Craig Booth and to defining, preserving, and perpetuating the spirit of Dixie embodied in his life and work.
Hi, I'm Lyman, host of the Not Forgotten podcast. For more than 40 years, I've been writing and publishing with the intent of connecting landscape and story in the American Southwest. I believe the words spoken by a character in a story by Barry Lopez. Everything is held together by stories, he said. That is all that is holding us together, stories and compassion. Dr. Craig Booth was a man of stories and compassion. His personal story is one of the many that have made Utah's Dixie what it is, and his compassion is at the heart of that elusive entity we call the Dixie Spirit. In today's episode, I'd like to share an essay that I wrote more than 20 years ago. It's a story, something that I wrote after a trip to North Carolina, to Tennessee and North Carolina. And when I returned home, I had a much deeper sense of what all this means, this idea of home and a sense of place and the idea of home ground. It's a piece that, as I've gone back to it over the years, I feel like it expresses how I feel about all of this. It gets at the idea of having a sense of place and what it means to really belong to a place, and how special places and the stories that go with them are at the heart of the Dixie Spirit. I wrote it, as I said, more than 20 years ago, and so there are aspects of it that are maybe a little bit out of date, especially where it mentions $500,000 homes. I think the $500,000 homes of 20 years ago are more like $4 or $5 million homes today. But it gets at this concept in a way that I wanted to share with you today. It's called Where All Our Scattered Forces Might Gather. Several years ago, I attended a work-related conference in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. I flew to Nashville, then drove 200 miles across the Tennessee heartland to Gatlinburg at the foot of the Great Smoky Mountains. This was all new territory for me. I'd grown up on stories of the bluegrass horse country of Tennessee and Kentucky, but I'd never seen it before, only in pictures and in my dreams. It was a 4-day conference with meetings running from 8 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon. The first morning, I walked into the conference hall with 500 other people and sat in the windowless room for several hours before an inexplicable power got the best of me, and I stood up. Walked out into the bright early afternoon, got into my rental car, and headed for the hills. It was mid-March, and spring was just beginning to peep through the Smokies. I drove out of Gatlinburg into Great Smoky Mountains National Park, up through the perpetual pines to the crest of the Appalachian chain at Newfound Gap. Then I dropped down through the fog-laden draws and ravines and across the Smoky Ridges into North Carolina. The landscape consumed me, and I, through all my senses, consumed it. All of this was strange and delightful. I was filled with a sense of joy at being there. But that joy, like the ridges I crossed, was clouded by the realization that this was not my country and could not be my country without a much greater investment. Not an investment in ownership of land, but an investment of time, study, experience, and listening, an investment of life there, an investment that would eventually lead to a belonging. The experience I was going through had actually begun a year earlier when I read a novel called Cold Mountain. In fact, it was the reverberation in my mind of phrases from that book that had lifted me out of my conference hall chair that afternoon and set me on my course through the Smoky Mountains. Few novels have captured my imagination the way Charles Frazier's Cold Mountain did when I read it in 1997. I need say little more about the book here except that it is the story of a wounded Confederate soldier making his way back across North Carolina to his home at Cold Mountain, to the place where he was raised, the place where all his dreams and all his stories converged. As Frazier states it, Cold Mountain soared in his mind as a place where all his scattered forces might gather. Reading the book had kindled in me a haunting desire to find Cold Mountain, and for the next 3 days, I would duck out of my meetings early and spend my afternoons crisscrossing the Smokies until I found it. There were 2 other folks from my southern Utah hometown at the conference that week, both of whom had, at my request, listened to the audio version of Cold Mountain before arriving in Gatlinburg. They, too, shared my enthusiasm to locate the actual Cold Mountain and joined me in the quest. One was Marge Shakespeare, the other Bart Anderson. Marge and I had both grown up on the southern fringe of St. George, Marge on a dairy farm in the Washington fields, and I on what was then the edge of town at 600 South. Bart Anderson was not a native of Utah's Dixie, but through adoption and through a pure love of the history of the area and more than 2 decades of telling its stories to hundreds and thousands of enthralled listeners, he became the Pied Piper of southern Utah's history and one of its most beloved citizens. Now, the 3 of us, each with roots sunk deep in southern Utah soil, were embarked on a journey to find a place called Cold Mountain, deep in the Great Smokies of North Carolina, all because we had been drawn to it by the words of a compelling story. It took us 3 afternoons and hundreds of miles of driving through the winding back roads of the Blue Ridge before we finally found it. On the last afternoon, we drove south through a light gray rain out of Waynesville, North Carolina, and made our way up through the rolling mountains to a section of the Blue Ridge Parkway. After hours of driving and searching, we finally caught sight of a sign at the side of the road that said, Cold Mountain, elevation 6,030 feet. We pulled off the road, our hearts racing, hopped out of the car and drew on our jackets. The rain had stopped, but the air was full of a palpable cold mist. We hustled over to the edge of the ridge and looked down across the undulating carpet of dark pines, then up toward the horizon. What we saw in that moment of pure exhilaration instantly brought our thumping hearts to a halt. All we could see as we scanned the far horizon was a great white mist, a smoky cloud of haze that shrouded all view of Cold Mountain. After all the days and miles and effort of searching, Cold Mountain now stood within our reach, but was restrained from our view by the very element that gave the Smokies their name. Demoralized, we stood speechless in the Cold Mountain mist and waited and prayed for the cloud to pass. But it never did, at least not within the short period we were allotted to stand there. As the minutes passed, we began to talk, and we began to take heart in the thought that this was somehow fitting, that even though we had read a book about the place, and even though the place had captured our hearts and our imaginations, it was really not our place and could not be our place to truly see until we had invested much more in it. A few hours in a place, a few books read about it, cannot make a place our own, does not allow us to see it or to know it as our own. It takes much more. In fact, as Wallace Stegner wrote, a place is not a place until people have been born in it, have grown up in it, lived in it, known it, died in it, have both experienced and shaped it as individuals, families, neighborhoods, and communities over more than one generation. It is made a place only by slow accrual, like a coral reef. Marge and Bart and I stood there craning our necks to see a place called Cold Mountain and could not. The cloud that blocked it from our view was not only a literal mist of white, but a figurative curtain representing our lack of knowledge of the place and the fact that this was not the place we belonged to. We consoled ourselves in the thought that we would soon return home and once again move about in a landscape where we comfortably belonged, where the history and the stories were our own. The next autumn, on a crisp morning following a stormy night, I drove from my house in Santa Clara, Utah, to St. George, as I often do, by way of the Pioneer Parkway, crossing U18 and winding down into St. George from the north where it connects with Skyline Drive. I'm always enchanted by the way this route brings you down over the red ledges above town and offers a dramatic view of the St. George Valley before you sink into town and get caught in the crazy current of its streets. On this morning, however, as I crested the ridge north of town and looked down across the valley, all I saw was a perfectly flat, fluffy carpet of white stretched from Black Ridge to Black Ridge. To the west, I could see the upper basalt ridge with its giant D for Dixie State College glistening in the morning sun. And to the east stood the sparkling temples and towers of Zion National Park on the far horizon. To the south, I could see the prominent knob of Segmiller Mountain standing sentinel over the Arizona Strip. But beneath me, where the old town of St. George should have been, was nothing but a glorious satin sheet of mist. I couldn't help but pull off at one of the Red Hill overlooks, get out of my car, and walk to the edge of the ridge. From there, it seemed as if I could simply step onto the white carpet and walk right out across my hometown. The sun shone brightly above me, and the entire scene glowed. There was something otherworldly about it. I was being offered a perspective on my home I had never experienced before. During the few moments I stood on the Red Hill that morning, I was drawn back to the afternoon along the Blue Ridge Parkway in North Carolina, where I looked out into the mist and struggled to see a place I was desperately drawn to. Here I was now in the same predicament, except here I looked out across a valley I knew intimately. Somewhere down below that sheet of white was the rise upon which the building once stood where I was born. Near it was the huge white edifice called the St. George Temple, where my parents, my grandparents, as well as my wife and I had been married. And around the corner and down the street was the house where my parents still lived, the house where I grew up, and the neighborhood where I roamed as a boy, and the sidewalks I rode my bike down, and the trees I climbed, and the ditches I hung my feet in on hot summer afternoons. Down there under that cloud were the buildings where I had gone to school, the fields where I'd played ball, the stores where I'd stood in front of large windows and dreamed of someday possessing all those wonderful things. I knew that down there under that billowy white carpet was my grandparents' house, the place where my dad had grown up, and the south fields where he had worked as a boy. I could see right where the cemetery would be, the sacred ground where the bodies of my grandparents and other loved ones lay. I could sketch in my mind the entire layout, from the imposing white temple in the middle of it all to the neighborhoods crawling up along the low ridges to the south, from the constant stream of traffic on St. George Boulevard to the handsome complex of buildings on the Dixie State College campus. None of it was visible to me in that moment. but I could see it all because I knew what was there. I could see it all in spite of the cloud because this was the place I belonged to. Most of us who grew up in southern Utah come from households where our parents very proudly passed on the great stories of this community. Because of those stories and their intimate connection to the landscape itself, we were raised with what could be called a very powerful sense of place. It is history, or more simply put, stories that connect us to a place. And so it stands to reason that if we have a strong grasp of our history, we also possess a strong sense of place. Again, as Wallace Stegner said, no place is a place until things that have happened in it are remembered in history, ballads, yarns, legends, or monuments. Fictions serve as well as facts. One of the great characteristics of this region is that it incites in most people who come here a powerful desire to know it more deeply and to connect to it in a degree that goes beyond the physical and the intellectual. Most of the people I talk to here are in the process of deepening their sense of place and thereby strengthening their connection to the community. Such an achievement can only be reached if we are willing to encounter a place with an open mind, with a sense of wonder at what the place is and what has gone on there before. We cannot come to a place with a preconceived notion that we know more than the natives, that we stand on higher ground. We must come to a place realizing that there are people in that place who have lived there all their lives, whose fathers and mothers have lived there all their lives, whose forefathers' sweat and blood and tears are part of the soil, whose loved ones' remains lie interned beneath the very ground upon which we walk. When we come to a place, we need to withhold our judgments and restrain our reactions until we come to know it deeply, until we have immersed ourselves in its history to a level where we've achieved a deep sense of place. To achieve this, the writer Barry Lopez has said, we must cultivate intimacy with a place, as one would with a human being. We need to memorize and remember the land, walk it, eat from its soils, know its winds, inhale its airs, observe the sequence of its flowers in spring and the range of its birds. To be intimate with the land like this, writes Lopez, is to enclose it in the same moral universe we occupy, to include it in the meaning of the word community. When we come to a place to learn something, Lopez tells us, we're obligated to pay attention rather than constantly to pose questions, to approach the place as we would a person, by opening an intelligent conversation. We will always be rewarded, he writes, if we give the land credit for more than we imagine, and if we imagine it as being more complex even than language. In these ways, we begin, I think, to find a home, to sense how to fit a place. I believe that in order for us to truly fit a place, to honestly belong to it, we must personally possess a connection to its history. In order to belong to this place, we not only need to read the books of Juanita Brooks, Carl Larson, Maureen Whipple, and others, but we need to discover our own personal connection to that history. We need to somehow bridge the gap between the pioneer times and our own personal lives here today. For some of us, especially those connected by blood to the pioneers, that gap is relatively small. For others, such as the young woman my oldest son married, the gap is a giant chasm. She is a native-born Hungarian who, until just a few days before her wedding, had never set foot on the red sands of Dixie. All of us fit somewhere between these two extremes, and all of us, if we want to call this place home, share an equal responsibility to connect ourselves to it by truly belonging. The amazing thing is that regardless of where a person falls on that spectrum, he or she can belong to this place as genuinely as anyone else. This fact has been proven to me time and again as I've witnessed people move here from every corner of the country and every part of the globe. And in a matter of years, this place has become as much a part of them as the blood running through their veins. Imagine yourself standing on the ridge above St. George on an autumn morning and looking down across a pure white carpet of cloud. How much of what lay beneath that cloud could you see in your mind and feel in your heart? You would be looking at a specific coordinate on the map, 113 degrees west longitude and 37 degrees north latitude, to be exact. You would be standing at the elevation of 2,900 feet above sea level, 7.6 miles north of the Utah-Arizona state line. That is where you would physically stand, and if that is all it meant to you, your sense of place would be minimal. From there, your sense of place would heighten as you learned that the black basalt ridge to the west was formed about 2.3 million years ago by a river of molten lava that flowed down from volcanoes just a few miles to the north. During the following 1.1 million years, water draining south toward what we now call the Virgin River eroded away the landscape on either side of the flow, leaving a long lava-capped ridge. Then, about 1.1 million years ago, a second river of molten lava flowed southward, forming the ridge upon which the old St. George Airport stood. During the ensuing million years, water washing southward scooped out the beautiful valley where St. George now lies. From there, your sense of place would grow as you became aware that a millennium ago, hundreds, if not thousands, of ancestral Puebloan people lived in pit house villages along the Virgin and Santa Clara rivers, and that many of those villages were located on the very sites where $500,000 homes and bright green golf course fairways now lie. That sense of place would continue to grow as you learned that as the ancestral Puebloan people disappeared some 700 years ago, this became the land of the Southern Paiute, that they lived for centuries in wickiup shelters built on the alkali ground where St. George's downtown and residential streets now run. That these families, the remnants of which are now the Shivwit people who still live in our community, subsided on what they hunted and gathered, and that they called the Virgin River Paurus and the Santa Clara Creek Tonnequint. That in the spring of 1861, the Latter-day Saint prophet Brigham Young stopped his carriage somewhere close to what is now Southgate Golf Course, gathered his entourage around him, and gazed up across the brush-covered valley and said, "There will yet be built between these volcanic ridges a city with spires, towers, and steeples, with homes containing many inhabitants." Your sense of place would continue to intensify as you learned that more than 300 families did come to this valley late in 1861, and for the next several years lived the most destitute lives imaginable. That Brigham Young, in his wisdom, determined to lift the lives of these people by announcing the construction of a marvelous meeting place. Construction of the St. George Tabernacle was, in essence, a public works project. It gave the impoverished settlers employment for which they were paid out of the tithes of other Latter-day Saints who lived in more flourishing settlements. That sense of place grows as you learn that the stone cutters who shaped the blocks for the magnificent building used their personal tools. And if you stop and look closely at the exterior sandstone blocks, you will notice the unique signature impression of each stonecutter's tool in each block. Often, when I've stopped to closely study those blocks, I've looked as well for the telltale trace of a drop of blood that might have been shed by one of those Herculean men. I'm sure any sign of blood on the surface of the stone would have long ago washed or blown away, but I suspect that remnants of the blood shed from their hands, as well as the sweat from their brows and the tears from their eyes, reside deep inside the stone. Standing on the red hill, looking down across the town, these are the kinds of stories that heighten your sense of place, that draw you closer to the landscape and allow you to begin to belong to it. Yet, there's still an even higher degree of a sense of place, a degree that reaches beyond the physical and the intellectual. It's an emotional attachment that, when carefully cultivated, can also become spiritual. I believe we reach this level when we've lived in a place long enough that our own sweat and tears and blood have percolated into the soil, just as the sweat and blood and tears of the men who cut the stones for the tabernacle still reside inside those blocks of sandstone. For us, in this modern age, it is not so much a physical or literal thing anymore. It is more figurative. We sweat when we go out on a limb to finance a home here or borrow the money to start a business. We bleed when we give of ourselves in service through our churches and civic clubs and PTA and charity programs. We shed tears when we see the suffering of loved ones due to cancer, Alzheimer's, heart disease, mental illness, and other ailments common to our times. And those tears sink deep into this place as we turn its soil and bury our loved ones here. These are our own stories, our own history. They connect us ever more surely to this place and make us part of the same history that goes all the way back to the day molten lava streamed down from the north. In Spanish, the phrase La Querencia refers to a place on the ground where one feels secure, a place from which one's strength of character is drawn, a place in which we know exactly who we are and from which we speak our deepest beliefs. That place might be somewhere in the St. George Valley. It might be on a ridge overlooking the Santa Clara Creek. It might be upon a certain pinnacle in Zion National Park, or along a forgotten trail on the Arizona Strip. For some who are only passing through, that place might be in the Sierras, the Tetons, or the Great Plains, or the forests of New England. Wherever it is our own cold mountain. It is the place where all our scattered forces might gather. As I visit with people about this place and about its unique aspects and about how special it is to people, I often ask them, what is your place? Or is there a place, or are there places that are sacred to you or special for you that connect you even more deeply than just the general landscape itself? And over the years, I've gotten many, many different answers, and I realized that, this connection to this place, Utah's Dixie, is not unique. Many people who live here, maybe their sacred place really is somewhere far from here in a very beautiful or in a very inspiring or amazing or important place due to a story connected to it. As I've talked to people, it's been interesting for some, it is that place at the top of a peak or on a mountain or something really spectacular. For others, it's something much more subtle or more specific to a certain plot of ground where something important happened. A few weeks ago, as I was visiting with Tweet and Nagi Zanotti, they were my guests in episode 2 of this first series of podcasts. I asked them that question, and I wanted to share their answers here. Tweets is one that I think everyone would totally relate to because of the beauty and the magnificence of the place. Nagi's is a little bit different, and it's tied more to story than it is to landscape. So here's Tweet answering that question.
The whole valley in Pine Valley is just it's even to me probably more home than St. George is. And that, I guess, is because, I mean, St. George is a great place, but it's become so big, and that's great because we know we need growth, but it's hard to see it change. It's hard to have it go from the little town to a larger town to a small city to a bigger city. And the only saving grace that I can say with that is that the people who have moved here come here for a reason. They're drawn here, and they're good people. And so it's continued to be a great place. But Pine Valley, for me, growing up, there were 29 houses and about 26 people in Pine Valley. And you could feel those who had come before you. You could feel them in the valley. And it's bigger now as well. There's probably 500 homes up there, and it's changed a lot, but still the people that have moved there are great people. And so you have to take a deep breath and say it's okay that they came, that it's not just yours anymore. But just the whole valley, the little chapel in that valley, very, very special place. Built by your ancestors, and just where you learn to love God and gain a testimony of the Savior, Jesus Christ. As Larry, my brother, often said, we did not know the people who settled here, but we knew those that knew them because we weren't that far removed. And I've just always appreciated the fact that I knew such great people and that they came from such great stock.
Now we'll hear Nagi's answer to that same question, and it's really fascinating to consider what he keys on here. Someone who was born in Iran, someone who came to southern Utah as a young man seeking his fortune, and someone whose perspective on all of this is so completely different, the frame of reference that he came from. And it's interesting to consider the place that stands out in his mind.
Special and very dear to my heart and very sacred place to me was the Red Hills Chapel on the 50 West, 500 North. When the first time I drove up there with the idea I'm going to the singles club to meet some singles. Ended up being the singles ward with my dear friend Jay Ains being the bishop of the ward. And where I met this beautiful girl. She was a Relief Society president. It took me for a while to realize that is a ward house, not the singles club, because I was looking for a singles organization, singles club to join because I was single. I didn't know anybody in St. George and I was just trying to have fun. And yet, the day that I walked in, I saw this beautiful girls and guys dressed up such a beautiful, it was Sunday, 2:15, and ended up going to the very first meeting, which was the priesthood meeting supposedly, and they had a flip schedule. The second meeting was the Gospel Essential class, and one of the girls was teaching the class, and two from the front row, middle row was Tweed was sitting there, and I was in the kind of nobody between us, and two in the back. The teacher said, "Open your scriptures." I thought, what kind of singles club is this? Why he wants me to bring scriptures to the singles club? Tweed, realizing that I don't have any scriptures, she got up and all the way came back and sat next to me, opened her scriptures. I still say that she has ulterior motive, but she denies it.
I didn't. My first thought when I saw him on the other side of the bench was, ooh, he's cute, but he's not my type. Then
the next class was the sacrament. here was Bishop inside the door, shaking everybody's hands and welcoming home or welcoming to the chapel. And I have been in the chapels and the churches, and I had taken the sacraments, and everything was just fine. So I didn't pay attention, of course, with the prayers. They passed the bread. I took it, no problem. When they brought the wine, I thought, what kind of church offers white wine? It's supposed to be symbolic of the blood of Jesus and supposed to be red. When I tasted it, it didn't taste as a wine either. I thought, this is water. What a cheap church. They can afford to give you real wine. But then they didn't pass the baskets to collect money. I said, that's fine with me. They don't collect money. They don't give real wine. It's still puzzled about the whole idea why the Singles Club have this kind of activities. Then after that, they had the fast and testimony meeting. These guys and girls beautifully bore their testimony of the Jesus Christ and Heavenly Father. Have their lives been saved? I thought, where have I been all my life? Why can I do the same thing? And then after that was over, they did the undoing the fast. They had the break the fast. They carried the food, I guess. They had this big croissant sandwiches and all the brownies you can eat and all the salad and pink lemonade. I thought, whatever this place is, I love it. I love it. I'm going to come back again. But that was my initiation for that. There's such a beautiful spirit that day, the fast and testimony. And of course, the result of that particular visit is sitting next to me right here. As you can see, how Heavenly Father has charted my course all the way from Urmia, Iran, 1975, from that vision up today.
The Doc Booth Foundation is dedicated to empowering individuals through educational opportunities and promoting mental health advocacy. Through scholarships and funding for important community needs, the foundation perpetuates the can-do spirit of the founders of this community, using the lessons of the past to chart the course for a better future. Make your tax-deductible donation at docboothfoundation.org. Not Forgotten is produced by Ricky Valadez and made possible by the generous support of St. George Area Zag Stores, industry-leading tech support and accessories. Lyman Hafen's books can be found at lymanhafen.com.
Once I lived in Cottonwood and owned a little farm. When they called me down to Dixie, it caused me much alarm. To hoe the cane and cotton, I right away must go. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. We came to Dixie, and we called it home. Oh, in Dixie, we've lived and grown. But the reason why they sent me, I'm sure I do not know. The hot winds whirl around me and take away my breath.